Welcome, everyone, to episode 3 of our Last Moments with Dr. Joel B. Kemp. I am Dr. Kemp, and it's an honor to have you back with us as we continue our journey into the Bible and race in America. Today's episode, we have two special guests. One that's very familiar to you as the host, the Reverend Dr. Dominique Robinson, and the second one who's been a guest with us on a number of times, but I almost feel like it's wrong to call her a guest. She is the one and only Dr. Gail Kemp, aka my wife, best friend, co-conspirator in the work of God, and some have learned to affectionately call her Dr. G. Uh, so before we bring them to the stage again, we always want to remind you, if you haven't yet, to subscribe to us, to make sure you do so on Facebook and Instagram, or you can subscribe to it on our website at jel.institute, and to get updates about this season, some of the new things that are coming. Before we dive into the meat of our conversation today, I always want to give you kind of a Hebrew nugget for our time. So if you remember in episode 1, I gave you the word which can mean people or army. Our word for this episode serves as a preview for what's coming, and it's the Hebrew word ot. The Hebrew word ot. And the word ot can be translated to be a sign, it can be a mark. In some cases, it even gets translated as kind of a wonder. The idea of this ot is that it's a term that has quite a bit of flexibility in its meaning in Hebrew, and has particular relevance for our conversation because it is the same word that gets used in Genesis 4 to describe the so-called mark of Cain. What's important about this ot in Hebrew is that it has no connection to black skin or black features, as that passage will come to be developed. But instead, it literally just means a mark or a sign. How one of my favorite writers describes it and says that an ot is simply God's mark, God's evidence of God's investment in your life. So as we get ready to turn to this conversation, remember that God has marked you. God has given an ot, which says that God is interested in you and in your well-being. And as Christians, we understand that that ultimate mark is what the cross is about. And for those of us who are on the heels of Ash Wednesday, who get ashes installed, and we literally have a cross as a mark on our foreheads, is a reminder of God's ot, God's investment in you. So with that reminder of investment, two people who've graciously agreed to invest their time with us will bring them to the podcast stage, Dr. G and Dr. Dominique. Welcome to season 4, episode 3 of Masterclass Moments with Dr. Joel B. Kemp.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's to be back home at
Yes.
Masterclass Moments.
Yes, y'all have to pardon me. I was caught up in the mark. I feel like Dr. Kemp, you don't preach. I said I've been marked by God. I almost had a Baptist fit out of my Pentecostal soul. I was
Get the little app in the background for you.
Yeah. Glad to be back. Glad to be back for sure. Well, Dr. G, we got you back. We got you back, and we harassed Dr. J earlier in the season when we first kicked off, and the people want to know: has anything changed with your parfait?
With the parfait?
Yes, that's
the parfait ensemble. I feel like I did something recently where I was saying at home, I was like, I need to mention this next time I'm on. I can't remember what it was. Maybe it's just a remix of the parfait, but the parfait's still happening because parfaits they just need to do their thing.
Right, they have a life of their own. Right?
A parfait is gonna parfait. What? Don't make me go on with this. I can rhyme with it. The parfait partay.
Yes.
I'm gonna stop.
That's it. That's
right.
The hashtag.
It's a wrap. Time out.
Parfait partay.
Show's over.
Well, yeah, we're so glad to be back. And Dr. G, we also have to ask follow-up questions because we again harassed Dr. J and earlier in the season. So how do you feel about this drop of Beyonce's new album coming out that she hinted at during the Super Bowl?
Yeah, I mean, it's always an exciting moment, those hints. You got to love the teasers of like, okay, all right, what's this going to be to build up the tension, the demand. And I try not to think about these. It's hard for me to look at advertising of anything and not think from a psychological and a social psychological perspective.
No, we want to know.
I gotta try. I try to turn those hats off. So I'm like the worst person to pitch something to, because I'm thinking like, okay, all right, I could see why you did that, why you did it that way, and I have to sometimes turn that off.
No, but I appreciate
I think the people want to know.
Exactly, because it's funny. Like we won't name the place that was giving us a pitch on buying a timeshare, and so halfway through it, Gail's like, "So you're doing the sunk cost fallacy right now, which presupposes these three things." Then he changed course. So now you're doing this particular strategy, which affects this.
Yeah.
You realize you're just annoying us now, because the next thing you're going to do is that.
Anchoring bias. That's the big one. Doesn't apply necessarily in the album drop, but that's the big one for advertising, which is that when you can prime someone's willingness to pay a certain thing by providing an anchor. So in other words, if I were to say, how much would you pay for this? Would you pay $1,000 for this? I've now created an anchor, and that anchor is $1,000. Maybe I was thinking the thing that was $10 all along, but now that I placed that anchor of $1,000, you're basically super excited when it actually is $10. But that, so I'm a bad person.
This all plays a role. No. This is great because it helps. Listen, all of our fields coming together on this platform and conversations. I'm like, yeah, those are rhetorical devices and tools for persuasion and what's happening there.
Absolutely.
And I know I'm paying attention to. So you're using this for my response, and you are like, so your mind, in the words of the young people, is ate up because you are deciding to use these strategies because you assume this about me, thinking that would persuade me. And I love all of this. Now, Dr. G, the next question in light of this is, some people were upset thinking that she did not give Usher enough time to celebrate his good job being done at the Super Bowl, and yet has taken some shine time away. What do you think about the people who think that about?
What do I think about the people who think that? They're completely wrong? No, I don't know. I just wanted to. I feel like sometimes when you're on a podcast, you're supposed to be very controversial and outraged. Yes. But except I typically am a very unbothered person about certain things, and it's really hard for me to drum up faux outrage. But I understand that folks have allegiances and alliances, and then when you've got a favorite of something and anything appears to be threatening that favorite, and this is going to come up later, anything that sort of threatens something that's associated with your passions, that in a sense you actually begin to associate with yourself through this process of mirror neurons and things. And so the outrage, I look at it as it makes sense from a social identity perspective. And I can't say that I resonate with that type of outrage because I'm just an unbothered person for these types of things.
Right. Listen, y'all, and we got Dr. J on the line who does interpretation and exegesis, but my interpretation of this is Dr. G said she don't care about all of that. Damn, her life. She said that's her life. Y'all go and be mad about Usher and Beyonce.
You're my translator right now. I appreciate it.
It's the Obama anger translator.
Exactly. I'll take it. My students always appreciate that. I feel like Dr. J sometimes serves as a translator. What Dr. G just said to y'all is this.
Right. My favorite of hers is when she describes someone as a concrete thinker.
Come on.
I
don't know. I don't. Go ahead.
And I'll just leave it there.
Okay.
The translation will happen offline, but that's one of my favorite.
We can say that.
I love that. Okay. And my last pop culture question for the both of you, in light of the things that we're going to be discussing today, is this: Meg Thee Stallion released a new song called "Hiss." Where she is explaining, and what we can see or track from her previous album, where she shared that she experienced depression and anxiety after the death of her mom, things of that nature. We know the case with the shooting and the perpetrator being found guilty, some loss of friends. Anyway, we get this new song where major diss track, though it's called Hiss because she's making a parallel of herself from the Stallion to now a snake, but that's another conversation another day. In this track, she and the parallel with this hiss and the snake is like, the shedding of the skin and this new her coming out. But in this track, she basically disses everyone who has dissed her. All right. And that's, great hip hop rhetoric, all that stuff going on. But what I want to ask the two of you is, in this track, she makes reference to Meg's Law, which is she's making a play on herself and her name, but she brings back up this law that many people were unfamiliar with, unaware of, around the kidnapping of a child and the alert being made known. And so there was some response to that. Let's put aside the actual kind of dissing of the people and not to dismiss, but also put aside also her identification of some of the mental distressors and emotional distressors she's been experiencing. But this moment of a pop culture track highlighting this moment or bringing into conversation this law that many people were unfamiliar with, that people were saying, well, it triggered the family. It triggered the family, bring back up this history and this culture and this or what occurred to Megan, the late young lady that, the family. Anyway, so that conversation. And so there was this back and forth of lots of people were unfamiliar, shockingly, of the law because people know Amber Alert, but do not know any relationship to Meg's Law. So there's that law piece that I, would love to hear from you all, because I personally feel like I haven't found the law that highlighted the loss of a Black girl, but that's Dominique. So we're gonna, whatever, or pushing that. And then this component of it wasn't ethical. What was it ethical? Because I don't know if that was her intent, but what was it ethical? There are people who are saying she shouldn't have brought it in. It was triggering to this family. There are others who are saying, well, it's a law, it's public domain, it's public knowledge. And so what would you two's perspective be from your fields of domain and experience around that kind of, now it's died down, so we're not bringing back no drama on our podcast, but would love to hear you all's perspectives.
Yeah, so I'll start. And this to me is one of those moments where our disciplines intersect nicely. So some of the work that I've done in Hebrew Bible scholarship, I've leaned heavily on certain notions of trauma and identity development. And that one of the tasks of identity development is, how do you incorporate trauma into your identity in a healthy, life-giving way? And so her track and others, it's not unique to her, but with music in general, is often that process of bringing these traumas into a coherent sense of self. How do you make sense of it? And so when you're talking, it came to mind, there's a podcast called The Pivot that's gotten some traction. It's not quite blown up like Club Shay Shay as a result of Cat Williams, but it has its own kind of deep following. And they had an episode with a brother named Michael Beasley, who was a former NBA player. And he's talks about a lot of his struggles with mental health and some of the challenges that led to his struggles. And one of the things he talks about is, if you ever listen to our music, we're just crying for help. We're telling you all the drama we're going through. So don't bop to our beats, listen to our story. And that came to mind when you're talking about the song His, is that certainly I can understand why someone might feel offended or feel triggered, and not trying to invalidate that. And at the same time, this is part of her own journey. A friend of ours who's in the recording industry will talk about that sometimes albums are therapy. And so, in a sense, and Dr. G can speak to this much more than I can, I don't judge someone in pastoral counseling about what they say, nor would I assume Dr. G would judge them in therapy. The challenge becomes when therapy becomes public domain and marketed. What rules do you apply? And so, again, from my perspective, I would tend to view it more as this is a confession that went public. No pun on, the album Confession, but that idea that happened. And so therefore I would want to frame any reactions within that context.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I love that quote of "Don't bop to the beat, but listen to the stories." I think one of the theories that many have is that bringing difficult things up to the forefront and talking about them actually makes them worse. And then the person who brings up the difficult thing is then doing harm. And I imagine this is part of the tension, is that there are ways of bringing things to the forefront that can cause more pain than others. But it doesn't, if somebody's not bringing it with malicious intent, trying to do harm, it ends up being essentially each person having to navigate within a communal context their own journeys through trauma. And when we've got multiple people who've experienced trauma in any community, then one person's way of processing it may trigger some pain, may trigger some hurt in another person's process. And I actually think about that a lot within the context of the journey of Black folk through the history of racial stress and trauma within this nation, is that we have all experienced trauma, historical trauma, and the ways in which we navigate that aren't always the ways that are helpful to others within the same community. And so my hope is that when there is mutual trauma, we learn to kind of give grace and space for each one to take their personal journey without that judgment that Dr. J talked about, but then recognizing, what's the saying, what's good for the goose is not good for the gander. I don't even know where that saying came from or really what it means, because I don't know but it's a saying. And the recognition that each person has their own struggle and journey. And yeah, I like to adopt kind of a non-judgmental, present focused approach to recognizing how people handle and process their own traumatic experiences. But I would say kind of learning to give space and grace.
Absolutely. And so for our listeners who are probably trying to figure out, like, what are y'all talking about? What are we Googling? Listen, let me just give a brief kind of explanation of what it is. The truth is, I also throw the hip hop stuff at Dr. J just to mess with him. So keep him young while he's aging out here. You know what I'm saying? Like, did you listen to Nicki Minaj? He's like, Dominique, that's why you're my little sister. You just tell me what's important about it. All right. Mind you, he will remind me, did you listen to Earth, Wind and Fire? I just want you to know this is what the relationship has to be. You got to stay balanced. So first off, just 1996, Megan's Law mandated public disclosure of information about registered sex offenders when required to protect the public. Megan the Stallion says in her lyrics, these H words, don't be mad at Megan, meaning herself, these H words mad at Megan's Law. And so those who were interpreting this lyric were believing that she was dissing Nicki Minaj, is married to an individual who is a registered sex offender. So it was the combination of this. And so I'm highlighting that for those who are listening, particularly who are very much involved in the Black church world, where we've had a lot of social media postings and conversations of demonizing people who have called out systems or asked questions, particularly Black women. And if you read me and you interpret me, you know exactly what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is, I hope you heard what Dr. G has shared and what it means to understand with a compassionate ear that maybe while you might not have done something the same way, what it means to be non-judgmental, to hear how someone else might be processing their trauma and or demonization or victimization, and also hearing that in their processing, when they're calling out systems for accountability, how that is happening and how that's happening, how it's both and how a lot of things are not, no pun intended, in the light of what we were discussing, black and white, but that there are a lot of gray areas, a lot of nuances. And so we want to be, I use Meg Thee Stallion so that for those of you who are paying attention to the Black church discourse around patriarchy, sexism, church leadership, I'm saying these same tenets you need to be mindful of that as you're listening, hearing, and reading and responding to people who are highlighting and naming, I have been violated, I have had trauma, and I want accountability.
Right. And it's important as part of kind of our conversations we deal with race, and certainly race and gender are often connected, is that it's never naming the disease, is never perpetuating it. Right. The disease is there. So when we have these questions about the inequitable treatment that women receive, the abuse that women receive, someone saying, hey, I've been abused, that's not creating the problem. Any more so than this, if someone who says, hey, there are racial prejudices and biases that make life in America for Black folk more difficult, that's not the problem. The problem is the systems that cause it to be more difficult. And so I think it's always important and kind of work that we do in every context, but particularly on these questions of race, gender, politics, to name the problem isn't the problem being described. The problem is that the problem exists. And so how do we
Mm,
manage people in articulating that? In light of, as Dr.
mhm.
G was saying, how we express and work our way through that will vary.
Right. Because
Right.
not talking about the problem just essentially is our head in the sand.
Right.
It doesn't mean the
Mm.
problem has gone anywhere. It just means we are living in a state of kind of ignorant bliss. And that is not helpful and doesn't move the ball forward as far as tackling and facing the problem.
Mhm. Which brings me to you all moving the ball forward in a dialogue that is touchy, that many of us have grown up in households told to never discuss the following things in public: race, politics, and religion. And you all have been on a crusade to do all of that and what, right?
Yeah.
We've heard we've heard in the episode 1 of Dr. Kemp on this sabbatical, doing this work, beginning this book project, which involves some lecturing and conversation and in-house, in-person dialogue. We know, as his co-conspirator in the fight for justice, Dr. G, that you've been on a road along with them, though not on sabbatical, but your disciplines working together. I know, I mean, that household of all that intellect and spiritual anointing and working is just amazing. And so we also heard and experienced in episode 2 some of that work. So post that time, post that series, what are some of your just kind of initial thoughts of what did it feel like to begin that work? Well, first, just tell us what was that? How did you, where, how, and why? And then tell us, what did it feel like to begin that journey as you're writing this book?
Sure. So the context for it is there's an organization at Candler called the Candler Foundry. They work in candlerfoundry.emory.edu. So they do a series of conversations in the community where they partner with local churches and ask faculty members at Candler to give lectures. In this particular church, Trinity Presbyterian, they have a 6-week kind of what in Black church tradition we call Sunday school, where they bring in lecturers to have a conversation for 6 weeks about some topic. So the director of the Candler Foundry knew that I was writing this book and talked to the pastor of that church, who actually is married to a colleague of mine, and asked, would they be willing to host it and have that conversation? So they eventually agreed, and so I went and gave a 6-week lecture, or 6 weeks of lectures there for about an hour. And it really was, again, focusing on the book, Blackness in 3D, Biblical Race, American Law, a Contemporary Crisis. So that's sort of the genesis of the project, or the lectures. To your question about how it felt, overall, it was well received. There were some intense moments, which you'll encounter later on in the season, and some conversations that were brought up, where you got some resistance, where being accused of being a racist and all those kinds of other things, which are kind of par for the course. So it never feels good to be attacked or to have one's qualifications questioned. But one of the things that Dr. G and I talked about, which was very helpful, was reframing it, so that to think about those attacks as the medicine going through the system, so that if this work is being done right and being done well,
Mhm.
it'll prick the consciences of our white brothers and sisters, particularly those in Christian churches, because it lays bare the accountability, right? Going back to what you're describing earlier, that, this old song from the 80s, we didn't start the fire. Well, you actually did. And you're pouring gasoline on it. And so part of what these conversations are about is to encourage my white brothers and sisters in particular to recognize that accountability in the work that they have to fix it, right? So that the system of the live white supremacy and anti-Black racism that it produces did not happen by accident. It was in the intentional work for centuries. Now, there's a young scholar, Jamar Tisby, who talks about in The Color of Compromise, this idea that all of these were the result of decisions that people and institutions made. So if we built it, why can't we then dismantle it? And so kind of one of our goals, and we've talked a lot about this, is there's a need for a fourth kind of reconstruction movement. But what we want to do is encourage our non-Black brothers and sisters. You take the lead in this one. We have been on the front lines for 400 years. And we can tell you the battle strategy. We can tell you some of these things. We can learn from one another in that strategy. But we want you to take the lead this time. One of the images we often talk about is, what was it? With Dylan Roof when he shot um, was half a dozen people, I believe, who passed away in that American terrorism.
12. Emmanuel 9. Emmanuel 9. 9.
Okay. Thank you. And at the funeral, one of the most powerful moments for me was when the white church did not want to go into the funeral, but simply stood around the church and marched and prayed. That to me that's beautiful spiritual solidarity for that moment. The question is then live in that moment, then that's expanded to work politically, work socially, and throughout all of our theology. So it was kind of a mix of how reframing of thinking about it in terms of it's the medicine doing the system. And so therefore the uncomfortable moments are good. They don't feel good, but they are good for the work that's being done.
Now, you all tell me if this question is going too far, although I don't think my questions always go too far. We know that Dr. Kemp, this is your book and your project. Dr. G, tell us what your role is. Obviously, we know as partner and spouse, but what role are you playing or contributing with the dialogues and conversations? Because we know you were there, and we know the skill set that you offer and share. But what's your your entry point that you're like, this is my thing. This is what I want to pay attention to and offer as these conversations are unfolding. And my husband is over here writing and doing this thing.
Right, absolutely. I hope I didn't make too much noise as I dropped something over here. So you might have seen a facial expression or two, but that's what was going on. And I feel like it's usually louder on the person's end than, so y'all might have heard nothing, but just saw my face. So it will explain what happened there. I'm gonna be careful not drop stuff. So to your question, though, excellent question, and this gets at the joint work and the joint vision that we have here. The concept that we talk about as far as the lie of white supremacy really grew out of conversations that we were having in our home, and so that's something that is a concept that we developed together, and that we're kind of expanding in different ways, but complementary ways, and so. Dr. J is exploring the influences of that lie from a biblical theological perspective, and the perspective, kind of the direction that I take that in, is the psychological impact and the behavioral result of that for white folk, and then the dangers of internalizing that from a psychological perspective from Black folk. It's sort of what are the soundtracks that the lie of white supremacy sends, and then kind of our intersection is what are the very cultural, historical, sociological, theological, the factors that is in a sense replay that refrain that that we call, that are part of the lie of white supremacy. And so I think for both of us, we talk about that concept as something that is a we jokingly might call that a Kemper combo, and then just the ways in which we take it and then remix it both separately and then together.
Exactly. So
Great.
one of the other kind of intersection points that you mentioned, Dominique, is that so we're writing 2 articles together, one of which will be kind of our unpacking of the lie of white supremacy within the context of what we'll talk about a little bit later in this episode, psychological concept of diathesis stress model.
Whoa, say it again for the people.
So diathesis, and Dr. G can correct me if I spell it wrong, DIATHESIS, so diathesis stress model or framework. So it's a sort of, some of our joint work is not only in conversations and lectures, but also in writing. So those 2 articles are
Oh,
Lord willing, the creek don't rise will be done within the next couple months.
y'all, we have to have a whole nother I mean, February was a great time to do this, but we have to have a whole nother separate podcast on like the married life of you and your scholars, like the sharing, like, come on, love languages. We're writing together, everybody. This is what it is. We're writing, we're reading,
You're
we're
right.
praying, we're eating parfait and raisin bran. This is what we do,
Yes.
guys. This is it.
Right.
This is y'all are
Right.
just, oh, thank you for letting me be your little sister so I can pray for a spouse to eat raisin bran and write with me. Do raisin bran crunch and write with me, man of God. But okay, so before we get into breaking down like the definition and spelling of those things, I gotta ask this general kind of question. Was there a way that you prepared differently or experienced what it's like to address this content with a predominantly white congregation or a body of people who will be listening to this? And then Dr. G, I know you were sitting there and listening and experiencing this. Like, did you have a moment as a spouse that you were like, oh gosh, as an additional Black body in that space of tension, fear, trepidation moment? So those are two different questions. So Dr. J, what was it like teaching to a predominantly white group of people around such hard subject matters? And then Dr. G, you're sitting in that space as an additional Black body, disrupting that space in some ways. Did you have any moments of mental, emotional, or physical responses that you couldn't articulate? And then because he is your husband, moments of like almost wanting to protect him, like, oh, don't go that far, moments. So Dr. J, what was it like?
Yeah, certainly it is a different preparation. One of the things that's true, and I like the phrase you have of disrupting the space. I believe it is Stephen Ray, but that could be inaccurate, who talks about teaching while Black. And one of the ideas is that once you enter a space, it changes, right? The old Sesame Street song, one of these things is not like the other. And so part of the preparation is recognizing that there will likely be more pushback in non-Black audiences and among Black audiences. Because for most Black folk, not all, but for most Black folk, there's no need to explain the lie of white supremacy and anti-Black racism. Like, we know that and experience that every moment of every day that we were conscious of it. And so in that sense, it's like explaining water to a fish. Of course, that's what it is. For many, again, not all of my non-Black brothers and sisters, there's often a case that has to be made. And as Dr. G mentioned, often in making that case, it pricks people at the very core of who they understand themselves to be, their religious traditions to be, this country to be. And so, as I often tell students at Candler, the riot on January 6, 2021 makes perfect sense if you believe everything you hold sacred is under assault. The question is, are you defending a lie that you've been tricked to believe is God's truth? And part of that confrontation of truth with lie produces that response. And so, to go back, pulling my old Baptist Black church roots, you don't go into a space like that without the full armor of God, because you understand there's a spiritual, eternal battlefield that's active in a way that's different than if I were at, Ebenezer Baptist Church, for example.
But before we go to Dr. G, just because y'all are listening and watching, and we are educators on this podcast, we want you to know Teaching While Black, the most current book in 2016, was written by Pamela Lewis. I'm sorry, let me say this name correct. Pamela Lewis. However, the book that Dr. Kemp is referring to is a collective of writings by Dr. Ray, Lynn Whitfield, and other African-American scholars, which was produced by the Wabash Center. And so go back to that one because it gives some kind of just beginnings and germinations of what it was like for a lot of our Black religious scholars who were the first at predominantly white institutions, and picked up from there. So I just wanted to, as y'all can see, my headline, not a struggling PhD student. Why? Because I'm stuck in researching and getting this project proposal approved. But okay, Dr.
You are
G,
citing your sources. It does my heart
it.
good as an educator, citing the sources, going to the references. I love it.
Like my committee members on the line, I need to make sure hey. But so Dr. G, what was it like sitting in that space? Yeah, what was it like sitting in that space?
Yeah, no, I totally get the question that you're asking. It was, I mean, there were varied moments, and we've had a number of times where we've been in similar spaces, and I think, you know, as far as that, um, I think one of the moments that comes later, is and Dr. J kind of referenced this earlier, is you know, when you sit and you observe and you see those moments where someone is not so subtly challenging the credentials. That's definitely a moment where you know, like, I know he can take care of himself. However, let me come here. Let me talk for a minute. Just come and talk to me.
Yes, ma'am.
I
Yes,
really,
ma'am.
Right.
I don't just want to know your name, but come and talk to me. Can I talk to
Huh?
There
you?
you go. There you go.
I just want to tell you some things. Um, so yes, there are some moments where I definitely had some ire, shall we say, where I did want to say, let me explain what's going on. But also the other thing, in these conversations, I can see almost in a very visible way that threat reaction that's happening in the room. And it's so strong and so palpable, and it's just right up my alley. That is what I do clinically as far as treating anxiety and fear based conditions. And just, you know, there's a part of me that just wants to stand up and say, can we have a timeout and now for a moment do group therapy? Because I want to explain to you all what you're experiencing right now, because you're reacting to it without interrogating it. And so you're assuming that your reaction is based off of a framework that is telling you the truth. And so, therefore, that being threatened is triggering this whole constellation of things happening. And you're going to try to protect yourself as if you really are in danger. And I want to help you to see that your brain is lying to you right now.
Right. And certainly
Therefore,
when we do our joint lectures, that's
right,
actually
I
what
get to do
happens.
that. Yes.
That
Yes.
invariably I'll say something and Dr. G like, okay, I noticed five of you tense up, your shoulders went up to your ears,
Right.
all
Right.
those things. Now let's unpack that.
Yeah, my favorite moment was that there was, and this is kind of a vision that we have, and I've got another project that's working on this, was when this concept of here's how threat happens in the context of talking about anti-Black racism, anti-racism, live white supremacy, before we were calling it that, in predominantly white spaces. Uh, there was one time where we did front load it with, here's what's going to happen to you. Here's what you're going to experience in this conversation, and here's why. And here are some things you can do about it in the moment when it's happening, so you don't just have to react to it in problematic and unhelpful ways. So, you know, Dr. J, anytime he's ready for me to give a little intervention up front, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice, nice. Well, we've had the blessed opportunity to be able to kind of eavesdrop a little bit on a part of the 6 week series, as part of the Masterclass Moments community. Help us understand a bit, Dr. Kemp. Kind of early on, you share, you get to the heavy stuff, but you know that first session that you do, you're setting up some groundwork. Tell us a bit about how you move from, one, you're very clear that race, or the writers of the Bible at least, or not, didn't have this US race construct in mind. And you do say, though, there's a clear identification of tribes, and these tribes. Dominique says from her US mind, well, those tribes were brown, so I don't understand. So help. So that's from the brown side, the Black side, right? Which
Right, right.
obviously then, my non-brown people are like, no, so help talk to us a bit about how you move from tribe, the Bible is talking about tribes, and then you say we all are trying to say we're Israel, right? So,
Right.
and Lord help us in the middle of this war that's going on,
Yes.
but everybody's trying to say that they're Israel. But help us understand how we get from this tribal writing to US racial construct, and then we identify ourselves, and we know that's still happening. The people, much
Absolutely.
of our rhetoric, and we're relying on this war in Gaza and Israel, is still rooted in who's saying they are this tribal group written in the
Right.
Bible and have rights to the tribal group's rights. So tell us how you trace that tribe to US racial construct.
Yeah, the very short version of that is, as you said, the Hebrew Bible is tribal. That is, it identifies a discrete set of individuals that make a community, or really a discrete community that has common ancestry, common language, or at least a thread of common languages, and often a common religious tradition. Right. So again, religious tradition, genealogy, language slash culture. That's a tribe. So Israel is a tribe or a nation made up of 12 tribes. The Moabites are a tribe or a nation. The Ammonites, the Hittites, etc. Um, what ends up happening very quickly in American context, and we inherit this from um, Europe, and particularly from Spain, Portugal, and Great Britain, tribe as kind of nation quickly gets morphed into tribe as racial group, so that to be the right religion becomes Christian, the right kind of geographical cultural becomes the Atlantic world or the Western world, and then you add to that race. So therefore Israel is not part of the Afro-Asiatic world. That is, they don't sit on the Asian and African continents. Instead, they become white because they are precursors to Christian. And so there's a very good but dense book by a scholar named Ivan Hannaford. Ivan Hannaford, called Race, the History of an Idea in the West, where he kind of traces the development of race from kind of Greek philosophy to the present, trying to make the argument that, again, the Greco-Roman world was not racial in the way we understand it in the 20th, 21st century world. But it is these tribes, these ethnicities, these political units that are central to the biblical world that quickly become racialized in American
Mm-hmm.
contexts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And this next question, both of you, Dr. G has hinted at, or not more than hinted at it, has addressed it. How do you all define lie of white supremacy and, and white supremacy? Like, what is that distinction that you want us to be mindful of?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think part of what we recognize in using the common phrase white supremacy, and one of the reasons we have stopped and we don't use that phrase by itself, is it presupposes the reality, existence, and validity of something. And so the reason we don't use white supremacy as if it is a thing is because our argument is that there has been a lie of white supremacy that has developed, and it is the belief in that lie that has resulted in the consequences of how people view themselves, the world, their entitlement to things, etc. And so what we invite folks to is just frame it up front load it with this reminder, this cognitive, this belief based reminder that it is a lie of white supremacy. And so that's um, kind of one aspect to it.
Yeah, and the other piece, kind of relating to it being a lie, is then we can ask, well, what supports this lie?
Exactly.
And so in the work that we do jointly, and you'll hear a little bit about it in the second lecture, is we talk about the lie of white supremacy, and then the myths and the narratives that support it.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we start with just the reminder, this is a lie, this is BS, then we can look at what are the stories we tell to rationalize that it is not BS, that it is somehow authentic. And so one of the tragedies of how the Bible and Christian theology have been misused is that it grounds the lie of white supremacy in the biblical tradition. So what ends up happening, and we hear more about this in later lectures, is that for many, and they're not necessarily conscious of this, although some are, but many are not, what ends up happening is if American values are synonymous with Christian and biblical truth, then any attack or critique of American values is in effect a critique of God and God's word. And so that's why you hear among many of our conservative brothers and sisters such intense reactions to things called, critical race theory, which again, it's not
Mm-hmm.
what they're objecting to,
Mm-hmm.
because it's viewed as ungodly, unbiblical. And
Wow.
so that root, right, that one of the myths that supports the lie of white supremacy is that we're just talking about Christian society and God's word. So
Mm.
that's all part of what we describe.
Now, tell us more. Were you about to say something about and add it to that, Dr. G?
I think I might be going to the direction of your next question, because I think I have an idea what you're going to ask next. So go ahead.
Yeah. So you all also don't use the word racist
I
anymore.
thought that's where you're going.
Yes. Yeah.
That
Tell
was,
us.
yes, that's exactly where I thought you were going. And it's really because that we feel like the use of the term racism for us puts the focus on it doesn't put the focus on the cause. Our argument is that the cause is the lie of white supremacy, and believing in that naturally produces anti-Black racism in order to support the lie, in order to allow the lie to persist. But that we argue that is the fruit, but that the root is the lie of white supremacy, and that when we really focus on the root, it tells us who needs to step up to take accountability and take action and face it. It calls automatically who should be at the table and at the forefront of that table.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So, so my question is, what other terms should we use?
Yeah. So what other terms should we use other than racism? And so again, we don't object to the term being used, but it's more like a lot of things kind of make the stallion conversation, right? Of if we say it's racism or racist, that term has become so misunderstood and misapplied that it now switches. Okay, then Black people, Asian people, prove that you're discriminated against on the basis of race, right? And the Supreme Court's recent decision in Students for Fair Admissions is a great example of that kind of lie of white supremacy being occluded by focusing on racism. And so what we tend to talk about is we ask, to what degree have you imbibed the lie of white supremacy? To what degree have you been infected and therefore affected by it? So for example, part of the article we're writing deals with this question of how does the lie of white supremacy affect policing? And so one of the things that we kind of are writing in this piece and trying to challenge folk to look at is, rather than assuming the Black person has to prove something about their innocence, the weight should be on why is there something presumed about their guilt. And so by switching the weight, the onus, as Dr. G was saying, it allows us to have a different conversation. And it also prevents us from getting into, well, I'll be nice, what I think is a deeply misguided and inane conversation about reverse racism. No, what we're talking about is, when folk use reverse racism, what you're really talking about is how have Black folk imbibed the lie of white supremacy such that we believe a lie about ourselves and act in accordance with that lie. So it's trying to change the conversation. Sorry, you're about to say something, Dr. G.
Yeah, no, 100% agree with that in terms of the importance of changing the conversation. Because going back to some of the deficits that we think are in the concept of racism as it has played out over time and how people are using it, not in necessarily in its historical use and its scholarly use, but the way in which it ends up getting used colloquially, is this sense that you have to, if you label somebody as racist, there's almost this inherent assumption that that person has overt and explicit negative views of Black folk, of this. There's a narrow interpretation of it, and there have been great efforts to expand and teach that the term is not just narrowly focused on people who have overt, like, I hate Black people type of attitudes. But what we're hoping is, and our thesis is that if we're using the term about internalization, imbibing the lie of white supremacy, then we're talking not not having folks look for where they have animus, but where you have perhaps indifference, or where you have a sense of deserving of things over and above others. That's part of that inherent lie of white supremacy.
Yes. So then what would you say is the responsibility of our non-white people, community members? I have had Asian colleagues, in essence, basically say that they have nothing to do with this conversation, don't identify as Black or white. I've had Latinx colleagues and students, in essence, basically say the entire conversation is always about Black and white, and yet Black folk are racist towards us. And so, what do you? I guess it's twofold. What do you think is the responsibility of our non-white siblings in Christ, and can Black or brown folk be racist?
Right. Yeah. So I think my first thought for that is, if we frame it again within this live white supremacy, then the question is, how have Asians imbibed and been affected by the live white supremacy? And so, whether one looks at kind of model minority mythologies, whether one looks at, again, the untold histories of how they were both persecuted and then also received financial benefits that Black folk did not receive, is all part of that, right? Same thing with our kind of Latin brothers and sisters. So there's a great book that Dr. G and I often reference, Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, which is, I would say a must read for folk who are really interested in this kind of work.
Wait, and the millennial says, y'all go watch Origin.
Yes. We haven't watched it yet.
We haven't been to that yet.
Yeah. Okay. And so go watch Origin if you cannot get through the full book, and then come back to another episode and we will tell you if there's a distinction, how much it deviates from the book and not. But in case you can't read the whole book, go out and watch Origin.
Right. And one of the real kind of insights that Dr. G and I use in our work from Caste is, think of the live white supremacy within the context of constructing a racial caste system, where African Americans are, the old Sunday school song, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in the sight, right? In America's racial caste system, black and red are placed at the bottom. Brown and yellow get situated somewhere in between, with white on top. Mm-hmm. So again, using the language of that song, my yellow, red, and brown brothers and sisters, you are slotted in America's system, and you are loaned elements of whiteness for your advancement and for our subjugation. And so we invite you to think about those loans of whiteness, because it's not something you own. It's leased to you at a very high cost. And so understand that reality. And then we can begin the conversation of your second question: what is your responsibility? To do the work of understanding how your communities are imbibing that and how they view it, right? And so, we will not use names to protect the guilty. Dr. G and I were on like a weekend retreat when we lived in Massachusetts, and we went up to a spot in Maine, and we encountered a brother of some form of the Asian diaspora who was like, my people, we're like the Black people of Asians because we always F up. And so I just kind of stared at him. Gail just kind of laughed. And then someone else tried to clean. Oh, no. What he's saying is try to clean it up. I just sat there staring at him. And Dr. G intervened in her most gracious of ways, because she realized my husband is about to not be Dr. J, but be Brother Joel.
Hey, sometimes it's necessary.
And so that to me is an example of imbibing that lie. So if you have that caste structure within that community, and the lowest association of that caste is Blackness, then you have imbibed that lie. And that's the work needs to be done.
Exactly. And that for us is the root of racism is the assumption that you're inherently supreme in some way, the lie that you're telling yourself. And so this is why it doesn't work when one tries to reverse it. It's not simply people, I think, try to reduce it to something more shallow, as in disliking people, because then that gets that just that just brings it down to something kind of petty, as opposed to something structural, deep, with deep roots and far-reaching ripple effects. Is that it's playground, I don't like you and you don't like me type of nonsense. No, our argument is that it's rooted in this structural hierarchy that is justified by the lie of white supremacy.
Yeah. Well, we've shared a lot just on the first piece, lecture 1 of the 6th series. Dr. Kemp, tell us, where will we be able to find these lectures, and then how will the Masterclass Moment community, or the JEL Institute community, be able to engage the reflections from the different lectures? So how will they be able to access them if they can, and then how will they be able to engage the reflections thereafter with your various guests that you'll be bringing on?
Yeah, absolutely. So what will happen is, as you saw, the first lecture you can access via YouTube, and all of them are available on YouTube. So you can go on YouTube and type in kind of my name in these lectures, and you'll see all 6 come up. And part of what we'll do, and you'll see on our website and also on our Instagram and Facebook, is as you read it, or as you listen to it, as you reflect on it, drop things for us in the comments. And what we'll do is we'll curate those questions, curate those comments, and that'll help inform the conversation we have when we have our live moments like this with our special guests. So it's really intended to start a conversation. Now, one of the things that's true about race, religion, and law, you could spend eternity talking about it in some ways and still not have answered every question. So we don't pretend in 6 hours of lecture and 6 hours of lives will solve everything, but hopefully begin giving kind of those pillars, those frameworks that allow us to have that deeper conversation. And so each week, like you saw for this episode, our guests will interact with certain things that they've worked on in their life that connects with what was discussed in the lecture and some of the comments that you've raised. So Dr. G and I have the luxury of, we live with this every day as we live with each other. So we could kind of take you a little bit beyond just what was there to a little bit of the backdrop to that story. But with the other guests, we'll get a chance to integrate their life stories, their work with my work, and the conversation, comments, questions, etc., that you leave for us. So we look forward to continuing that conversation over the next 5 episodes that we'll have guests for that.
Awesome. My last question is to leave us with some levity before you give us our wrap up is, do each of you have a favorite diss track?
Ooh. Wow.
Oh, wow. Oh.
Wow. That's a great question.
I feel like, honestly, my favorite diss tracks might be like a biblical line. So, sadly, not sadly. It's not
that's
sadly.
Fine. That's great.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking of the and Dr. J, you know where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
The will the real God please stand up? Kind of I'm gonna pour the water around, and where's your God at? Why ain't your God showing up?
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. Yes, that's a story. That was one that had to come to mind for me as well. In First Kings, where Elijah and the prophets of all, right, and it gets lost in translation, right, where it says, "Well, maybe your God is away on a long journey." Well, the idiom that's used there is actually when it suggests maybe your God is on the toilet.
That's what I thought.
And that's what I started to say, but then I was like, no, that's not what the text said. Where'd I get that from? Okay, because you taught me that. That's where I got that
That's
from.
it. Yeah, we've been taught by the Hebrew scholars.
Exactly. I was like, let me not start talking about toilet up in here. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's I forget, I'll try to remember the source of it, but there's an interesting kind of tracing of that for what that idiom comes to mean. So that's one. So yeah, all my attempts were biblical. I was trying to think of a hip hop one. The one that just came to mind is, "I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman." And that's more talking trash than the diss track necessarily. But I like that kind of that word play and
of course you would.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I also tell people that's how I eventually was able to get in hip hop, is when people say, no, think of it as poetry and wordplay. And so kind of thinking of it that way, then those little nuggets are really nice to think about.
Well, beloved, you have heard their favorite diss tracks, which you know the disses are biblically based, which lets you know who you're dealing with around here with the Kemps. Okay, thank you for sharing that. I had to end us on a smile after such heavy content that we've discussed and that we know we will continue to engage. And Black people often use humor as a way of navigating hard things. While things aren't funny, we can still find a way to smile. So I appreciate y'all sharing your diss tracks, and hopefully you all come up with a track together as you all write your articles and
There you go.
do your lectures.
Exactly, like the Kemp diss track.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, as we wrap up again, I want to thank Dr. G for gracing us with her presence. As I said, a friend, wife, and co-conspirator in the work of God. So it's great to have her. As always, our host, the one and only Reverend Dr. Dominique Robinson, aka Little Sis to the two of us. And proudly say she's not only not a struggling PhD student, she's an excellent PhD student. So she is doing quite well. Look forward to her dissertation being finished soon. So again, thank them both for taking time. Thank you all for making time to be with us and enjoy this conversation. And again, as always, we hope there are a lot of good nuggets, good food for thought to keep you going as you kind of deal with this world that God has placed us in. Often I end with a general thank you and a little Hebrew word that I gave you at the beginning, but I want to end a little differently today, given the seriousness and heaviness of this. A student of mine a number of years ago had asked me, Dr. Kemp, how do you keep hope in the midst of all of this? In the light of all of this, how do you not lose faith, lose hope? And I often remind them of what has been strengthening to me, which is when I study the Hebrew Bible, I'm reading texts by people who were the losers of history. They were on the underside of empire. The entire Bible was written about a God who was present in those very moments. As Christians who are in the season of Lent, we are in what one of the writers called the midnight hour of the soul, the place where hope is easiest to be extinguished. Psalm 46 gives us a powerful answer that says, God, in English translation, says, is a very present help in trouble. The Hebrew there literally says God is very old. He is very there. He's very found in trouble. So for me, hope comes in trouble because I know that's where God is very found. Or to use Dr. G's words, I get excited when the world goes crazy because I'm waiting to see how God will order it. So my prayer for you as you leave this week in this podcast is when life gets crazy, get excited to see how God will order it. As the psalmist tells us, God is very much found in times of trouble. And because God is very much found in times of trouble, the slogan of JEL is always true, that God gives you just enough light for the step you're on. God bless, safe travels on this journey, and we'll see you next week for next Masterclass Moment with Dr. Joel B. Kemp. Thank you.